few years ago, up near Chicago, a man's car broke down and he couldn't get it going. It was cold. He really didn't have the right clothing. He never dreamed the car would quit, and was standing there beside of his car and finally turned and started walking up the interstate. The car pulled over. The man hit the button and the power window went down, and he said, "Do you need a ride?" He said, "Man, I'm freezing." He said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm trying to get into Chicago, get to a garage. I don't have a phone with me, and I need to get a mechanic and a tow truck or something to come and get my broken down vehicle." He said, "Slide on in." One of those real expensive cars. He slid into the seat and began to warm up, and he glanced over at the driver and saw how refined he was and how classy, and he could tell that he was a businessman, and there was something about him that expressed success, and they began to visit. And suddenly, the writer felt impressed that he ought to say something to the man about his soul. Awkward silence, and finally said, "You've been kind enough to give me a ride. Could I be kind enough to tell you that there is a way to get to heaven besides Chicago? Have you ever given your heart and your life to God?" The man was quite startled, and he looked over at his writer and he said to him, "Well, interesting that you should ask me," and tears came into his eyes. He said, "I've got a Christian wife. She's a saint. She never misses church. She supports the church. I've never tried to fight her. But," he said, "I've never been open to the gospel, and I put her off time after time and saw the disappointment on her face and the wetness of her eyes, and I need to get to God before long. I need to get things solved with God." And the writer said to the driver, he said, "Well, sir, why don't you do it right now?" Well, he said, "I guess that's what I ought to do," and just pulled over to the side of the interstate and began to sob, holding onto the steering wheel. The other man that was riding began to weep, and they began to pray, and God gloriously saved that gentleman, that businessman. As they entered Chicago, he said, "I'll take you wherever you need to go. I've got just enough time. Tell me where you need dropped off." And he gave him an address. And when he was getting out of the car, the businessman pulled from his shirt pocket a business card. And he said, "Sir, thanks for leading me to Christ. Thanks for dealing with me so I didn't keep putting God off. I appreciate you praying with me. Here's my address. I have an entire floor in a high rise with my offices. I own a company. If you're in Chicago the next time, why don't you stop by and visit with me?" Some months passed, and he was coming into Chicago and got to thinking about that man who had kindly given him a ride, and he'd prayed with him. Fished around and got in his billfold, and he found that business card with the address, located the high-rise building, parked the car, went inside, got on an elevator, rode to the floor on the card's address, and found the office doors and knocked on the door gently and opened the door and stepped in, and there was a white-haired lady. She was stacking files on the desk, and she said, "Can I help you, sir?" He said, "We're closing the business down, but what can I do to help you?" He said, "Well, ma'am, I've got this business card. I met a man, and here's his name, and he invited me to come if I'm ever here to stop by and visit with him." She said, "Well, he's not here." All right. He was disappointed, said, "Would you tell him that the man that he gave a ride to stopped by to see him?" She said, "When did you get a ride?" And he told her what day it was. Some months before. She said, "What time of the day was it?" And he told her. Well, she said, "Sir, that man was killed in an automobile accident probably 15 minutes after he let you out of the car." He looked at her and she looked at him, and he saw the tears in her eyes, and he said, "I'm so sorry. You must have cared about him." He said, "You know, I'd like to just say something to you. I happen to be a Christian man. And as I was riding along, I felt the Spirit of God impress me to talk to that man about his soul. He told me that he was married to a Christian lady that had prayed for him and begged him to come to church and urged him to get right with God. And he said, I put my wife off and got off all these years, but I think it's time that I get right with God. And he said, I told him right now would be a good time. And said he pulled over the side of the road and God saved him. And she began to sob, but she said, that man was my husband. And I'm so glad I'd have never known this side of eternity that my husband died right with God if you hadn't stopped to tell me. What I'm trying to say, folk, we need to be led of the Spirit. And we need to start finding out what the mood of God is and what God's talking about, and quit just living our lives as though there's no heaven and no hell and no God and no devil, and realize this thing is a whole lot bigger than our little life. And begin to get in tune with what the Spirit is trying to say to us these days.